Good morning. I shall tell you the life story of one of the world's most recognisable works of art. Picasso painted it in response to events on the 26th of April 1937, when, at Franco's request, German and Italian aircraft bombed civilians in the Basque town of Guernica. Measuring 3.5 metres by almost 8, it's a large painting, oil on canvas, in black, white and shades of grey. I guess, like most of you, I've had some familiarity with the painting and its backstory throughout my adult life. However, I hadn't looked at it closely until the early summer of 2009, when I rode my bicycle along the north coast of Spain and my route took me through the town. I came across this life-size tile replica and was captivated by it. I didn't get to see the original in Madrid until 2012, after which I spent a great deal of time looking at Guernica on my computer screen, thinking about it and researching its history. That eventually led to this lecture, which I gave twice in 2014, and I'm delighted to have been given the opportunity to dust it off for this morning. I shall start with some biographical background concerning Picasso. Then we shall look at the bombing. In January 1937, Picasso had reluctantly agreed to do a mural for the Spanish pavilion at an upcoming World's Fair in Paris, and the bombing gave him the inspiration that he needed. I'll show you how the picture developed, and I'll attempt to convey the meaning of its individual component parts. We shall then follow Guernica's itinerant life from its initial showing at the exposition in Paris to its installation in Madrid's Reina Sofia Museum of Contemporary Art in 1992. Pablo Ruiz Picasso. Under Spanish naming convention, we would expect to refer to him as Pablo Ruiz, after his father. He did think of himself in that way until he was in his early 20s, when he became Pablo Picasso after his mother. There's an interesting theory as to why he made the change, which I'll come to later. Certainly, there's nothing to suggest that he had any difficulties with his father or his father's family. He was born in Malaga in 1881, and at the age of 91 he died near Cannes in the south of France in 1973. He wasn't only a painter, he was also an engraver, a sculptor and a ceramicist. And he was prolific. More than 22,000 works are attributed to him. His father, José Ruiz, was a painter and teacher, and when Pablo was 10 years old, the family moved to A Coruña, where José became a professor at the School of Fine Arts. At 14, Pablo and his family moved to Barcelona when his father took up a position at the School of Fine Arts there. You can see from these two pictures that Pablo was a prodigy. He was admitted to his father's school at the age of 14. He didn't like the strict rules and skipped classes. At 16, he entered Spain's #1 art school in Madrid. Again he skipped classes, spending many hours in the Prado. Think of this picture as a GCSE project. At 18, in 1899, he returned to Barcelona and became part of the radical intellectual artistic circle at the Four Cats Café. In 1900, he made his first trip to Paris, after which he divided his time between there and Barcelona. From 1904, he was based permanently in Paris, and he made his last visit to Spain in 1934. Picasso was an admirer of Velázquez and Goya, and he believed his own work was pretty good too. I think that if you were to ask him for the identities of Spain's 3 greatest ever artists, these are the names that he would mention. Velázquez painted portraits at the court of Felipe IV. He also dealt with religious, mythological and historical subjects. Goya has been described as the last of the old masters and the first of the moderns. He also was a court painter and was a chronicler and analyst of events including the Inquisition and the Peninsular War. As we see later, Picasso was obsessed by this picture by Velázquez, Las Meninas, or Ladies in Waiting. It shows Princess Margarita, daughter of Felipe IV, with her maids of honour. A chaperone and bodyguard are standing behind the group. The Queen's Chamberlain is in the doorway. The artist has included himself. He's painting the King and Queen standing where we are and reflected in the mirror on the far wall. The 3rd of May by Goya. This also had a strong influence on Picasso. A popular uprising against Napoleon's invasion had taken place in Madrid the day before, triggering the start of the Peninsular War. The uprising was brutally put down and many were executed the next day, the 3rd of May. Guernica is close to the coast in the north of Spain, in the Basque province of Biscaya. It's usually spelt the Basque way, with a K and without the U. The town is a revered place for Basques. From the 14th century, meetings between representatives of each parish in the province of Biscaya were held around an oak tree, the tree of Guernica. I photographed the current tree in 2009. Sadly, it had to be replaced in 2015. An assembly house was completed in 1883. This glass roof was installed over a courtyard there in 1985. Following national elections in February 1936, a fragile left-wing coalition formed a Republican government with a small parliamentary majority over a fragmented right-wing opposition. There was violent conflict between right and left in the following months, culminating in a failed coup attempt led by Franco in July. The rebels expected a rapid success. Instead, the Civil War began, a war of attrition that continued for almost 3 years, until the 1st of April 1939. It was in fact several civil wars all rolled into one. 10 months into the war, on Monday the 26th of April 1937, Guernica suffered close to total destruction. It was market day, and this is where the market was held in those days. At Franco's request, bombers from Hitler's Condor Legion, with Italian help, subjected the town to several waves of bombing, and people fleeing were strafed by machine gun fire from fighter planes. The population of the town was about 7,000, and on market day many more were present from the surrounding area. Most men of fighting age were at the front. Estimates of the number killed varied widely, from around 300 to about 1,650. During the bombing, or the fire that followed, 3/4 of the buildings were destroyed and most of the rest were damaged. The objective was to terrorise the civilian population and to give the Luftwaffe carpet bombing practice that would be useful in the wider conflict that was expected soon. More obvious targets were not touched: an armaments factory, the tree and the assembly house, and the bridge. Guernica wasn't alone. The red towns here were also hit by German and/or Italian bombers. A month before Guernica, 200 civilians died in the bombing of Durango. As in Guernica, fleeing civilians were strafed from the air, and many other parts of Spain had similar experiences. And Guernica wasn't the worst. 10 weeks earlier, following the Battle of Malaga on February the 8th, thousands of refugees fled along the coast road towards Almería, mostly on foot and mostly women and children. Between 3,000 and 5,000 were massacred. They were attacked from the air, from the sea and by land forces, and body parts were still being found along the route in the 1960s. What made Guernica unique was the presence nearby of the world's press. Journalists heard the news that evening in Bilbao and immediately headed for Guernica. If the world's press had been driving down the N340 towards Malaga in the second week of February, Picasso would have been inspired 10 weeks earlier, and I'd be talking now about a different picture. The most influential report concerning Guernica, by a young South Africa-born British journalist, George Steer, appeared on the 28th in the London Times and the New York Times, and also in Ce Soir, where Picasso saw it. The report began, "Fire was completing today the destruction of Guernica, ancient town of the Basques and centre of their cultural tradition, which was begun last evening by a terrible onslaught." As I said earlier, in January 1937, Picasso had reluctantly agreed to do a mural for the Spanish Pavilion at an upcoming World's Fair in Paris. His brief was to produce something to support the Republic, and in January the government had rented studio space and installed a large canvas. Picasso didn't like working to order, he needed inspiration. Now, 3 months later, he had it. 3 days after reading Steer's report of the bombing, Picasso produced his first sketches. Elements of the final picture were already present: the impassive bull, the anguished horse, the fallen warrior, and the woman with the lamp. In the earlier sketches, Picasso included Pegasus, the winged horse of Greek mythology, emerging from a gash on the horse's flank. The original sprang from the neck of his mother, Medusa, when she was beheaded by Perseus. This optimistic reference to rebirth did not survive to the final picture. Only 5 weeks elapsed between the first sketch and completion of the picture. 55 years later, it was moved to its present location, the Reina Sofia in Madrid. I took this photograph in 2012. It was great to see a very attentive party of young children looking at the painting and listening to its story. Let's take a closer look at the picture and try to deconstruct it. Picasso gives us no help. He didn't explain to us the symbolism in the picture. He said, "There are forms that impose themselves on the painter. He doesn't choose them. It isn't up to the painter to define the symbols. The public who look at the picture must interpret the symbols as they understand them." He goes no further than making a general statement about depicting the horror of the Civil War and blaming the nationalist rebels for it. "I am expressing the horror of the military caste, which is now plunging Spain into an ocean of misery and death." These mouths are as wide open as the jaw will allow. We've all seen these mouths on the children in our lives. They signal acute physical and/or emotional stress and are disturbing. Do any other images make as powerful an anti-war statement as Guernica? Maybe this Pulitzer Prize-winning press photograph comes close. These kids are fleeing from their village, which has been attacked with napalm. There are 2 small elements here which give this picture the power to kick us in the stomach. Those 2 mouths, exactly like the ones I included on the last slide. I think if you close those mouths, the picture loses much of its power. And Picasso chose to use the same mouths to fill us with horror at the suffering when we look at Guernica. The other 3 figures, the bull and 2 women, do not have these mouths. They have a different role, which I'll come to later. First, we'll take a closer look at the sufferers. The horse is clearly very distressed, contorted, with its legs all over the place. There's a javelin in its side and a long gash. The light above is not benign, it's a harsh glare. There are strong similarities between the Guernica horse and this one, which Picasso painted 3 years earlier. It's been gored by the black bull and its entrails are spilling out of its stomach. You'll remember that Picasso included Pegasus, the winged horse of Greek mythology, in the sketches that he drew on day one. This is an interesting picture. Boy leading a horse, without reins. The horse seems to be derived from a late 15th century Italian Renaissance painting, Parnassus, by Andrea Mantegna in 1497, for a wealthy noblewoman shown as Venus beside her husband, portrayed as Mars. Pegasus, also without reins, and Mercury are on the right. Picasso's horse on the left is clearly based on the Pegasus on the right, which in myth is a symbol of creativity, imagination and inspiration, which undoubtedly is how Picasso saw himself. In Spanish, Pegasus is Picasso, which sounds just like Picasso, and some art historians believe that this is why Picasso started using his mother's name rather than his father's Ruiz. Wailing to the heavens, an anguished mother holding her limp dead infant. Later in the year, September 1937, Picasso did a large 2-metre wide and much more elaborate standalone picture showing the same situation, again in monochrome, mother with dead child. He described it as a postscript to Guernica. The mother's outstretched arms are more pronounced than in Guernica, suggesting that he is drawing on Goya's Tres de Mayo. The figure at the bottom of the picture, the fallen warrior, dismembered and with a broken sword. The faint flower is a rare note of optimism. Here again Picasso draws on Goya. Picasso's fallen hero and the man before the firing squad in Tres de Mayo both carry on their right palm a wound like those of the crucified Christ. And another figure in agony in the flames of the burning town. Also crying heavenwards, a faint dove, a symbol of peace with a broken wing. Doves were important to Picasso. One of his daughters is called Paloma, the Spanish word for dove. So the picture includes 5 suffering figures: the horse, the mother and the dead baby, the fallen warrior, the woman in the burning building, and the dove with a broken wing. I think the 3 remaining figures, 2 women and the bull, are observers, not participants in the carnage. They don't have the suffering, gaping mouths. First, a shocked-looking girl with a benign light, searching for information or understanding. I think that she represents the media who brought the story of the bombing to the wider world, including Picasso. She is believed to be Marie-Thérèse Walter, whom Picasso met in 1927 when she was 17 and he was 46. She was his mistress for several years until the mid-30s, around at the time their daughter, Maya, was born. Picasso was married to a Russian, Olga Koklova, from 1918. She was a ballerina with the Ballet Russe. Paolo was born in 1921. They remained legally married until Olga's death in 1955, though she had sought a divorce since 1935. Picasso refused. He did not want her to have 50% of his wealth. Back to the picture. A woman with what looks to be a quizzical expression. Since she is half kneeling, adopting a low profile and dragging a leaden foot, I think that she represents the governments in Paris, London and Washington, dragging their feet and adopting a passive, non-interventionist position, doing nothing to aid the Republicans, the legitimate government. Finally, the bull, an animal with which Picasso was obsessed and which looks placid and docile here and certainly not angry or aggressive or physically harmed. In order to understand the meaning of the bull, I think we can learn from the Velázquez masterpiece. And another royal grouping, this one by Goya. The artist has included himself on the left in each case. Goya has paid homage to his great predecessor and at the same time implicitly bracketing himself with Velázquez. We know that Picasso considered himself to be in the same league as these two. And I think he's included himself in his masterpiece in precisely the same position as the others. And he has emphasized the parallel by including that lighter coloured wall or closet to the left of the bull's head, producing a line consistent with the edge of the Velázquez and Goya canvases. In fact, I think that the connection is deeper than those three red lines. He has given the bull, i.e. himself, the eyes of Velázquez, looking directly at us, the left one a little lower than the right. That's not random chance. Just about every brushstroke that Picasso ever made was precisely where he wanted it. And he's given himself Goya's jaw, quite prominent and angled half right. So in addition to the suffering figures, 3 people and 2 animals, it seems to me that Guernica includes 3 observers, the artist represented by the bull and 2 women representing the media and the major Western democracies respectively. Picasso makes no room in the picture for the attackers. No planes or bombs, no Franco or Hitler, no military personnel of any kind. I think he took that route because during an air raid the targets are on their own. The plane has left the scene before the bomb does its damage. And Picasso is portraying a detached, cowardly form of warfare. On any fine morning in Malaga, Picasso's birthplace, you can sit down and have a chat with him, as I have done. I wanted to get his reaction to the interpretation of the various elements in Guernica that we've just been through. The 3 observers in particular, and his use of the mouths of distressed children to emphasize the suffering. His response, "Peter, I've never said this to anyone before. You are absolutely spot on." The picture did not have a clear predetermined structure. It evolved. Picasso said that painting is the sum of its destructions. A painting is not thought out in advance. While it is being done, it changes, as one's thoughts change. And when it's finished, it goes on changing, according to the state of mind of whoever is looking at it. Dora Maar. She is important because she chronicled the evolution of Guernica with her camera. She was a photographer, poet and painter. She met Picasso in 1936 at the age of 28 when he was 54. She was already prominent in the world of photography and art. She became a rival of Marie-Thérèse and soon replaced her. Beautiful and Sad, The Weeping Woman. Picasso eventually dropped her for Françoise Gillot in 1944. But she had a collection of Picasso's work which he kept until her death at the age of 90, and she retained a house in Provence. Her photos record how Guernica developed. Work began on the canvas on May the 11th, and this is the result after day 1. The body of the falling warrior is still whole, and he has raised a defiant arm. Also, the horse's head has not yet reared up, and the bull's body is the wrong way round. At the bottom, towards the right, there's a woman who will soon disappear. In the second photo, some detail has been filled in. The sun has been introduced. It will be removed later. And the raised hand is now holding a bunch of flowers. The small flower, bottom centre, is more prominent than it will be in the final picture. In photo 3, more filling in. The horse's head is now the right way up, but it's still low. In 4, the more positive elements have been removed. The sun has been replaced by what will become a harsh electric light, and the fallen warrior's upright arm has gone, taking the bunch of flowers with it. In photo 5, some collage has been added. The bull's body has been turned round, and the horse's head is now raised. In number 6, the collage has been removed. Perhaps it's too colourful a component. But in number 7, it has returned, and more has been added on the left. The collage is finally removed in number 8. The fallen warrior is now on his back and dismembered, and the dove has been added. The door or closet has been added on the left behind the bull, making it easier for us to conclude that he is a self-portrait, comparable to those of Velázquez and Goya in their court paintings that we looked at earlier. Finished. So the picture became increasingly negative as it progressed. We have the early removal of Pegasus. The fallen warrior lost his defiant arm and flowers, and he was eventually dismembered. The sun was replaced by a stark light bulb. The experiment with the colourful collage was discontinued, and the damaged dove was a late addition. There is just one hopeful note, the small faint flower above the hand holding the broken sword. The Paris International Exposition of Design and Technology in Modern Life opened on the 24th of May 1937. Only 5 pavilions were ready, including Russia's and Germany's. Overall, the event was a success, attracting 37 million viewers. Facing each other at the entrance were the Nazi eagle perched on a swastika and 25-metre-tall statues of workers holding aloft a hammer and sickle. On the 12th of July, the Spanish pavilion and Guernica opened, number 35 out of an eventual 42. It didn't have a lot to do with design and technology. It set out to demonstrate the Republic's legitimacy and show its suffering. Here's the position that Guernica occupied. Reaction to the picture was quite subdued and mixed. Art historian and critic Christian Zervos said that it made a powerful statement. From Picasso's paintbrush explode phantoms of distress, anguish, terror, insurmountable pain, massacres, and finally peace found in death. It was capable of having a profound effect on people who were not art experts, such as the woman quoted here. "How dreadful all that is! It makes my back tingle, as if a spider had been put down my neck. I don't know what it's meant to be, but it gives me a very queer feeling, just as if somebody is cutting me in pieces." But there are some negative reactions in the art world. According to a prominent Basque artist, "As a work of art, it's one of the poorest things ever produced. It has no sense of composition, or for that matter, anything." After the exposition closed, the idea of a Guernica tour developed to create awareness of the Republic's plight and to raise funds for refugees. Early in 1938 it went to Scandinavia as the star of a large exhibition featuring the work of several major artists, and it went on to London later in the year. It was important to raise awareness in Britain of the Civil War, where official policy was non-intervention. The prime movers were Roland Penrose, an artist, historian and poet, and Scottish MP the Duchess of Atholl, known as the Red Duchess, chair of the Joint National Committee for Spanish Relief. A successful exhibition at the Whitechapel Gallery in East London was opened by future Labour Prime Minister Major Clement Attlee. The Whitechapel Gallery appeared in the Guernica story much more recently. In the 1950s, Nelson Rockefeller wanted to buy the picture, but Picasso said that it was not for sale. However, he did agree to a tapestry, and 3 copies were made. One was bought by Rockefeller, and after his death, his wife gave it to the UN on indefinite loan. It hung outside the Security Council chamber in New York, where impromptu press conferences are often held. In 2003, when the US was trying to get UN approval for the war with Iraq, Secretary of State Colin Powell stood before the TV cameras with the tapestry, a powerful anti-war statement in the background. It had been covered by a blue sheet. Later, Guernica and other artworks were removed from public view at the UN while renovations were being undertaken, and a Polish artist, Gośka Makuga, arranged for the tapestry to come to the Whitechapel Gallery for 2009. That table was part of the installation. Groups could book it for discussions and debates on peace-related issues, with the tapestry as an inspirational backdrop. Back to the original picture. Immediately after the Civil War ended, it went on a tour of the US. As on its earlier visit to London, the objective was to raise funds for refugee relief. While US policy had been one of non-intervention during the Civil War, there was a great deal of sympathy for the Republican cause, and the New York art world loved Guernica. Reaction in Los Angeles and San Francisco was cool. People there were more used to and comfortable with traditional representational art. The right associated Picasso and Guernica with extreme left-wing politics and the Soviet Union. A newspaper headline in Chicago described Guernica as Bolshevik art controlled by the hand of Moscow. Towards the end of 1939, the Museum of Modern Art in New York put on a retrospective exhibition of Picasso's work. Alfred Barr, the first director of the MoMA, was a passionate promoter of modern art. Guernica was the star of the exhibition, together with 2 other major works by Picasso. One was Demoiselle d'Avignon, which Barr had persuaded the MoMA to buy. It's considered to be the start of Cubism. Avignon is not a reference to the town in Provence. It was a prominent Parisian brothel. The other was Girl Before a Mirror, a gift to the MoMA from Mrs. Simon Guggenheim. It is thought to be a representation of Marie Therese contemplating her old age in the mirror. Except for some touring time by Guernica, these three were to hang together in the MoMA for 40 years. But before settling permanently in the MoMA, Guernica went on another US tour. Picasso could have left France during World War II if he had chosen to. For example, Alfred Barr at the MoMA offered to arrange a move to New York. There were rumours that Picasso was a Nazi collaborator, but there's absolutely no evidence to support them. He was right to fear for his own safety. His left-wing sympathies were well known, and they were thought to have contaminated his work. Franco, who had sympathisers in France, was after retribution. Picasso's output dropped, and he became more or less invisible, while Guernica was doing a celebrity tour of the US. There was a change of partner in 1944. Françoise Gillot, a painter and writer, replaced Dora Maar. At the time, she was an art student, 40 years younger than Picasso. They had two children, Claude and Paloma. In 1953, Françoise left because of Picasso's abuse and infidelities. She took the children with her and wrote a kiss and tell book in 1964. Also in 1944, Picasso formally joined the French Communist Party. Paris had been the centre of the art world when Picasso went there in 1900 and continued to be into the 1930s. On the other hand, American art was at best considered to be a poor imitation of European. That was to change, with New York becoming the centre of gravity of the art world. The city had a raw vitality, and during the Depression, artists were encouraged to create outdoor murals with public funding from agencies set up under Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Despite the Depression, there were wealthy patrons with money to spend, such as the Rockefellers, the Guggenheims, the Whitneys, and the DuPonts. Exiles came from Europe and joined an emerging group of talented homegrown artists. New York artists appreciated Guernica and identified with the communal struggle that it portrayed. Guernica inspired the abstract expressionists, the most famous of whom was Jackson Pollock. He was an often violent alcoholic and died in a single-vehicle traffic accident at the age of 44. He created pictures by flicking a paint-loaded brush at the canvas or by allowing paint to drip from his brush. He was known as Jack the Dripper. Here are two of Jackson Pollock's works, both very large murals, around 5 to 6 metres wide. The lower one, which is in the MoMA, was moved to Guernica's space after it was shipped to Spain in 1981. During the Cold War, the FBI kept tabs on Picasso through the US Embassy in Paris. He was listed as a subversive and in 1950 was refused a visa. Guernica was considered to be a communist brainwashing tool. Modern art in general was condemned by Pope Pius XII, who had been known as Hitler's Pope. He saw it as degradations and defamations of true art, which at times openly affront decorum, modesty, and Catholic piety. An American president, Harry Truman, believed modern art to be a communistic and the vapourings of half-baked lazy people. Committees in the House and the Senate were set up to expose and eliminate communism in public life. As part of that effort, Joe McCarthy's Senate committee investigated the organisers of Guernica's 1939 American tour. Picasso invited attention from anti-communists. For example, during the Korean War, Massacre in Korea, painted in 1951, was a critique of US foreign policy. Here again, he's drawing heavily on Goya's Tres de Mayo. In 1953, around the time that Françoise Gillot left him, Picasso met her replacement, Jacqueline Roch. She was 27 and he was 72. He painted 400 portraits of Jacqueline over a 20-year period, from 1954 until he died in 1973. They married in 1961, 6 years after Olga had died, and Jacqueline was with him until his death. She eventually committed suicide by gunshot 13 years later. To recap, these are his 5 long-term partners by whom he had 4 children. There were many other more casual affairs. Guernica began touring again, visiting Europe for the first time in 15 years. In October 1953, it was the star exhibit in a Picasso retrospective exhibition in Milan. It finished the year in Brazil and undertook a 6-city tour of Europe in 1955 and 1956. In 1957, it was included in a Picasso 75th birthday retrospective at the MoMA, and followed that with visits to Chicago and Philadelphia. On return to the MoMA, it was clear that restoration was needed. Picasso decided that the picture would not move again until it was heading back to a Republican Spain. By the 1950s, the paint had dried out completely, losing flexibility. The picture was stressed when rolled onto a drum for shipping, and, when hung, being held tightly to prevent sag led to damage at the edges. On the surface, flakes were lost and paint was lifting. In 1957, the paint and canvas were reintegrated using a wax resin. More cleaning was done in 1962, and the surface was covered with a matte varnish. In Spain, for years following the Civil War, punishment of supporters of the Republic continued, with imprisonment, execution, and forced labour. Families were spied upon in case they were hiding fugitives, exiles drained the country of talent, and fear led to crippling inertia. Criticism of the regime had to be coded. In many homes, a reproduction of Guernica replaced a portrait of Franco. Praise for Picasso and Guernica was a way of indicating support for a whole range of anti-Franco ideas. In October 1957, Picasso's obsession with Velázquez's Las Meninas exploded as he began a series of 45 paintings reworking the masterpiece. It is believed that he was motivated by homesickness, the work symbolizing his attachment to Spain. He had no intention of seeking French nationality, but would not attempt to obtain a Spanish passport because he would have had to deal directly with Franco's bureaucracy. In the 1960s, there was a growth of optimism in Spain, with the country opening up to mass tourism and new ideas. Small exhibitions of Picasso's work were mounted in Madrid and Barcelona, and the idea of a Picasso museum in Barcelona began to take shape. The museum opened in 1963, the driving force behind it being the writer Jaime Sabatés, a longtime supporter of Picasso. Sabatés' own collection of Picasso work was the core of the museum when it first opened. In the late 60s, the regime became receptive to the idea of a Picasso revival. Florentino Pérez, Spain's Director General of Fine Arts, was persuasive in playing up Picasso's greatness as an artist and playing down the influence of his politics. The idea of bringing Guernica home was a divisive one. Voices on the left would say that the regime is hijacking a Civil War icon. Those on the right would say that it represents an embrace of communism. Conscious of his own mortality, Picasso gave power of attorney concerning Guernica to a Paris-based lawyer and prominent socialist politician, Roland Dumas, still alive at 98. Picasso's instructions were that the museum must, prior to any initiative, request the advice of Maître Roland Dumas, and the museum must comply with the advice he gives. And he put his own position in writing, confirming that, since 1939, I have entrusted Guernica and the studies that accompany it to the Museum of Modern Art in New York for safekeeping, and that they are intended for the government of the Spanish Republic. Franco died 2.5 years after Picasso, and it soon became clear that Spain was following a democratic path. The clamour for Guernica's homecoming increased. Several cities believed that it should go to them. The Prado was the front runner. It was the nation's leading art museum, and Picasso had expressed a preference for it. But the Prado didn't have a suitable space, given the likely visitor numbers and the security requirements. As Picasso's birthplace, Malaga had a claim and was already a major tourist centre. He was born in this building. Barcelona had played a major role in Picasso's development, and it could be said that the city's Picasso Museum was a logical place for Guernica. Basques believe Guernica belonged to them. The town inspired Picasso, but there's nothing in the picture that says Guernica, and Guernica was far from being alone in its appalling loss of life. The Guggenheim. In designing the building, Frank Gehry included a space for Guernica, but there's nothing to tie Picasso or the picture to Bilbao. It was generally accepted that Picasso would have been happy with Spain becoming a democracy without necessarily being a republic, and the King's response to the attempted coup in 1981 demonstrated that Spain was indeed on the road to stable democracy. Later in the year, which coincidentally was the centenary of Picasso's birth, Guernica did come home, entering Spain for the first time. The culture minister said that today the last exile returned to Spain, and El País spoke of the return of our national dignity. It was installed in the Casón del Buen Retiro, an annex of the Prado, close to the main building, on the edge of El Retiro Park. It was protected by bomb-proof glass. A new museum of contemporary art with a dedicated space for Guernica was being planned to replace the existing one, which was losing money. In September 1992, the Reina Sofia Museum for 20th Century Art was officially inaugurated opposite the Atocha train station in an 18th century building, formerly the San Carlos Hospital. It was a logical home for Guernica. Without being rolled up, the picture was packed up for the last time for the short journey to the Reina Sofia in July 1992, 11 years after its arrival in Spain. The journey was made at night, and power cables and overhead traffic lights were taken down to allow passage of the large box. And this is where it has been now for almost 30 years. Despite many requests for a loan, there is no prospect of any further movement. I think that this is a great quote with which to finish from a man who wrote an excellent book about the picture. Guernica's power to shock has, despite the millions of reproductions, never gone away. Its rejection of human barbarity and its cry for liberty and peace remain as insistent today as the day Picasso put down his brush back in 1937. Thank you very much.